Okay, everyone, it's 9 o'clock. We'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to session 4 of the 21st Annual Northwest Interlibrary Loan and Resource Sharing Conference. NWIL's land acknowledgement is read at our opening and closing sessions. To view NWIL's land acknowledgement statements, please visit our website, nwil.org, under the Land Acknowledgement tab. Today's date is Wednesday, September 14th. This session is titled CDL, Small Steps Toward Better Sharing, and will be presented by Sue Garrison and Perry Collins. My name is Tammy Bueller, and I am the convener for this session. This session is being recorded with permission from the presenters. Because they retain the copyright to the information they are presenting, they may choose to request its removal from public viewing in the future by written request to the NWIL committee chairperson. However, at this time, it is planned that recordings will be made available once captions have been added. Attendees will be notified when recordings are available. To turn live captioning on, click the CC link at the bottom of the screen and select Show Subtitles. If you have a question during the session, please use the Q&A function in Whova, and I will pose these to the presenters at the end of the presentation. When the presentation ends, please complete the post-session survey in Whova located on the conference homepage. NWIL and presenters appreciate and do use your feedback. On that note, I will turn the session over to the presenters.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tammy, and thanks to all of you for attending. And really just thanks to NWIL in general for this really well-organized and communicative conference. It's really hard to do that in a virtual setting, so thank you. So I'm Perry Collins. I am the Copyright and Open Educational Resources Librarian at the University of Florida. And I'll be starting us off today and talking a little bit about CDL in general, some of which might be a little bit repetitive for some of you who have been immersed in these conversations, but maybe not for some others, as well as some of the work that we're doing at the University of Florida. And again, I wear a couple of different hats there, so I won't speak as deeply to some of the technical pieces of our approach, but I will acknowledge my colleagues, Todd Digby and Lily Pong, who also work with me on our CDL team. And aren't here to speak to those today, but I can always put you in touch with them later if you have questions. But for now, I'm going to ask Sue to go ahead and introduce yourself before I get going.
Thanks so much, Perry. So I'm Sue Garrison. I'm Director of Access Services. I'm also the Education Librarian here at Rice University, and I'll be sharing our experience with CDL and what things that we're doing here at Rice University.
Wonderful. And we'll have a lot of time for questions as well. So I think we'll each speak for about 12 to 15 minutes and then leave plenty of time to get into the weeds of some of this. So there we go. So just to give a little bit of an overview of controlled digital lending for those who are just starting to dip their toes into this work, and some of the things that we're thinking about. Controlled digital lending really is rooted in this idea that as libraries, we've been investing in print collections, especially for many decades, hundreds of years in some cases, for a very, very long time. We have massive print collections. And obviously the pandemic jump-started a lot of these conversations, but even well before that, for 15 plus years, I think many of us have been talking about how do we actually make these more accessible to those who are maybe not able to get to our campus, which increasingly includes quite a few of our own students or our own patrons at other kinds of libraries outside of academic libraries. And so it really does kind of, for us, it really has started a lot of conversations about how do we do this in ways that we feel are both legal and ethical and increasingly aligned with community standards. That's something that I'll talk about a little bit here and there. But that's one of the things that's been most exciting to me about this work is that a broader community has really developed around controlled digital lending that helps us kind of think about where we are in our risk assessment, but also just allows us to talk to colleagues about this work from many different kinds of institutions, sizes, types of libraries. There's just a lot of this work happening in ways that maybe it wasn't even a few years ago. So this slide talks a little bit more about some of the protocols and especially around some of the rights and risk assessment. And I'll keep using that phrase risk assessment because for those of you who have looked at, Kyle Courtney and Dave Hansen's white paper on controlled digital lending, for instance, which is really wonderful, you'll see quickly that there is ambiguity here. And some of it really is incumbent upon us in libraries to talk amongst ourselves, our communities, with our general counsels, and have conversations about what we're comfortable doing as much as there being sort of bright lines. As we know in libraries, there often aren't bright lines when it comes to copyright issues. That's something that our colleagues in access services have always had to kind of grapple with. And so thinking about how we are flexible, but also keeping our institutions and ourselves safe is something that we're always balancing. So, the controlled piece of this is kind of where some of the rights pieces come in. So how are we actually going about lending materials that were once digital, that maybe we have scanned to make, or excuse me, that were once print, that maybe we have scanned to make digital in ways that we feel are within our risk threshold. So the one-to-one own-to-loan ratio is the biggest piece of this probably that many of us have heard about and thought about quite a bit. The idea being, of course, that if I have one copy of a book, then I'm only lending out one digital copy of a book. If I have two copies, then I can lend out two digital copies, or maybe I have one digital copy on loan and then one print copy behind the desk on print reserve. So there is a really important piece there. And, the concept of that is really simple. The logistics of it sometimes are a little bit difficult. What kinds of processes or workflows do we need to change, both kind of day to day with staffing, but also in our own systems to make sure that we're tracking that and being really cautious that we're keeping that ratio intact so that there can never be kind of an accusation that we are, say, undermining a commercial market for materials by lending more copies than we actually have invested in, we've actually purchased ourselves. The next piece of this, and I won't go too into the weeds here because there's so much else written about it already, is sort of this balancing act of components of the actual copyright law. And probably the most important of these for controlled digital lending are fair use and first sale. So section 107 of copyright law and section 109 of copyright law. Fair use, as we know in general, is the most flexible of all the exceptions. We're constantly relying on fair use in libraries to allow us to make specific collections available to patrons. We're also really looking at that here, particularly when it comes to things like copying. Something like copying is often part of fair use. These kind of work in tandem, I would say. And again, I would refer you back to Kyle Courtney's and Dave Hansen's white paper, because they have a wonderful and really extended discussion of how these two sections kind of work together. They talk about about fair use quite a bit, but then also first sale, this idea that if you are the first to say buy a print copy of a book, then we can give it away or lend it out. Basically, something that obviously is foundational to the ways that libraries work in the first place. There's been a little bit of ambiguity and discussion about the idea of digital first sale. And so they talk quite a bit in that white paper about just the idea around the libraries as a special case, that we are non-commercially aiming to make our collections more accessible. And that might look a little bit different than some of the other digital for sale cases that we've seen that have been much more commercially oriented. And at the very least, the spirit of that idea that we are kind of represent this special case might really help support that fair use argument as well. So again, I won't go into that anymore, but it's something to keep coming back to and try to get our heads around to make sure that we're able to have conversations fluently with our own legal counsels as well. DRM, this is another piece of the controlled part, trying to find ways through any of the systems that we're using for controlled digital lending to make sure that we are not allowing things like downloading or recirculation of files, printing, as we know, there are always going to be ways to crack DRM, get around DRM. We're trying to do due diligence and make sure that we're being responsible as libraries to avoid that as much as possible. Establishing loan limits. So for instance, many of our materials at UF are available for 2 hours, which is in line with what they would have been for print reserves. This might vary depending on the type of the material, but thinking about how do you kind of recreate a digital environment that is lined up with how you might lend print materials in general. And again, assessing risk along the way. For us, this has meant building a really great relationship with our general counsel's office and checking in with them. I'm our copyright librarian, but I'm not a lawyer. And so that risk assessment has to be a group conversation wherever you are. So reasons for CDL. Some of these are kind of self-evident, but some maybe less so. But thinking about how do we make the argument for why this is valuable and worth doing, not only in terms of risk and that it's worth kind of taking the risk, but also just in terms of capacity. For us, capacity has been just the biggest issue. Do we have enough people to do this? What decisions do we need to make? There's a lot going on there. Certainly accessibility, and here meaning accessibility quite broadly, thinking about how do we make materials more available. So we're having lots of conversations about different kinds of materials. Those might include materials that are, as it says here, of more local importance, maybe materials that kind of live in this odd 20th century US copyright space, where we don't necessarily know for sure, we don't have time necessarily, honestly, to go through thousands of books and do assessment of copyright status, where it's unknown. And so it might be worth taking the risk for those to make them available. Again, this is something that white paper gives some good examples of, in some cases, quite low risk examples of controlled digital lending. Also thinking about what's equitable. This was something that was incredibly important for us during the pandemic, especially, and the pandemic isn't over, and a lot of these issues have stayed with us, that many of our own students can't reach campus, and that might be because of we have students with disabilities, it might be because of distance. There are lots of different kinds of reasons why someone might not be able to actually reach, say, our print reserve material in our actual physical libraries. Thinking about what's inclusive, this mentions flexible font sizing. So that's one example for accessibility. Sometimes accessibility I've found is also a challenge with CDL, that sometimes the systems we have, at least at the University of Florida, we haven't been able to have a platform that works especially well with screen readers, for instance. So we've had to find workarounds. But in general, at the very least, it moves us away from kind of some of the print copies that we have and gives us some options in terms of accessibility, and also thinking a little bit more strategically about who we're making materials available to. Economical, while there's definitely an investment of time and money and people in creating materials, setting up systems, maybe paying for digital platforms to do this. Increasingly, those are part of commercial options. There's money that goes into CDL, but there's also money that we're not spending on things like shipping, and in some cases on newer kind of new copies of materials. We might not need as many copies for print reserve purposes. So there is kind of a balancing act there, and it's definitely a factor to take into account. And then finally, in the environmental and some of the transport issues. So again, this kind of connects back to some of the economy piece as well. But certainly having just fewer cars on campus. I know that's important for us at Florida. We're always having a parking situation. So if we can help people access materials, honestly, in ways that they're already going to access them, right? Many of our students aren't going to come to the library to get these materials, and making sure that they have that access from home is increasingly really, really valuable. So I'm going to go ahead and dive into some of the work that UF has been doing, and Sue can certainly give some broader perspective as well if I missed anything in those slides. But let's go ahead to this. So talking a little bit about this, it's kind of hard for me to believe now. It's been a couple of years that we've really been delving into this. It was really my colleague Lily Pong, who she is the head of our access services division, and she was starting some of these conversations even before the pandemic and thinking about how do we make more of our materials, especially our off-site collections that get less use, available through a CDL mechanism. And those were just really kind of pie in the sky ideas at that point. But like so many other institutions, when the pandemic rolled around, we had kind of pretty urgent needs to make sure that we were connecting our students with materials. And so like many others, we started with course reserves. And I know now, many of us, including us, are talking about other kinds of ILL possibilities, other kinds of models that we might think about. But early on, my real job as our copyright librarian was to sit down and work with Lily, with our IT team, with our lawyers at UF, and think about how to actually develop at least a short-term policy and rights strategy that could take us through this very uncertain time in the first year or so of the pandemic. We were fortunate in that everyone kind of jumped to this. So we were able to kind of get something going and in place within a few months. That was something that I was really grateful for. At the time, it was a little bit scary because we didn't have a lot of examples to work from. But fortunately, we had enough expertise in the wider community that we were able to kind of, have a few phone calls, tap into some conversations that were happening, and develop a policy both for controlled digital lending as well as for video streaming, which was something is a different model, but something that kind of forced us to ask similar questions in terms of risk, in terms of what's available, in terms of access to physical collections if people can't get to our DVD collections, for instance. And so we put that together. We also then moved on to kind of prototyping and piloting tools and workflows. Early on, this was kind of like, okay, what do we have? We're not going to pay for anything new right now, if only because of time. So what do we have? And we had, fortunately, we had Google G Suite through the university. And we were able to kind of cobble together a system, and my poor colleagues, I didn't have anything to do with this at all, but they cobbled together this very elaborate system of Google calendars. Every book had a calendar, and there were appointments for all those calendars, and very little was automated, honestly. But because they kept the size of the program fairly contained to, I think, about 20 titles or so at that point, it was doable. And so they were able to kind of check in and out, and again, keep that controlled part going. I think that was useful in showing that even with relatively minimal resources, this is possible. It does not necessarily take an out-of-the-box solution that you have to pay a ton of money for. But that said, it was a pain. I think they would agree with that. We also started then, like some other institutions who are members of HathiTrust, we took advantage of their emergency temporary access system, which basically allowed us to access some titles that would, for the most part, be dark archived, would be inaccessible to us otherwise, in order to use those from a controlled digital lending perspective. So titles that we had in our collections that were also available digitally through HathiTrust, we were able to get access to, and that saw pretty enormous usage. As we went on, we kind of were working towards sustainability and maintenance of all of this. And so in the spring, we had benefited from some of the CARES Act money, and we had gotten a grant from our state library services agency. And part of that was promising that we would do what I've called here kind of a road show. So we did a series of local presentations, kind of similar to this one, but a little bit more kind of getting your feet wet in CDL for several of our regional Florida library organizations. And those were really great conversations. Again, talking to people from many different kinds of institutions in Florida, including smaller academic libraries, community colleges, public libraries. So lots of different options there. And again, thinking about community building. How do we go back to organizations like the Controlled Digital Lending Implementers Group, which I would really recommend is for those of you who aren't part of that already. In fall, we were able to make a major update to our system. We worked with somebody who had been, I think is no longer, but was at Fordham University as a developer there, who developed open source software that worked on top of our Google setup to allow for more automated kind of one-to-one control of checkouts and everything like that. And so that was really useful and made sure that we didn't have to go through, as I mentioned, this calendar system anymore. And could kind of just check in, check out. And then in fall, we updated our strategy and policy document. That's something I can share. Maybe during the Q&A, I can dig up the link to that. But we do have a public strategy document that guides us in terms of policy and copyright. It's pretty careful not to say we will do X, Y, and Z, because again, capacity is always a question here. We want to make sure that our policies are kind of allowing us to do everything we can, but in reality, we might have to keep scoping and seeing what's possible when it comes to money, technology, people's time. And that's something I see as my role as more of a policy person in the libraries, is helping my colleagues do what they can and feel safe about it, but also not dictating what anyone has to do. And then finally, right now we're kind of at a point where we're maintaining and sustaining a small program. We still only have about 20 titles or so that we're actively putting on CDL, and then starting to think about discussions for our future work. So kind of reiterating a couple of points from the previous slide. One of the questions that we had from the beginning that we kept asking as a guiding question was, how do we emulate the print reserves program digitally? This was useful from a logistical perspective, but also from a risk management perspective. How do we think about, we're making sure that we're not kind of, again, undermining any kind of existing commercial market, because we're trying our best to make this as much like a print reserves model as humanly possible. Things like 2-hour checkouts, things like the 1-to-1 ratio, along those lines. We have chosen, which I think is relatively uncommon from what I can tell, but I might be wrong. We've chosen to restrict this right now to online courses. We have a huge online program at the University of Florida. And so that's partially in terms of capacity and also just based on need. We still have our print reserves program, so students who are on campus can come and take advantage of those reserves, but those who are not might have other options. We do, like many others, check for an ebook to be available at a reasonable cost. That's an important part. Some people call this a market check. So for instance, if something is not available, we feel a little bit safer from a risk perspective of going ahead and making it available through our CDL program. And then the scope of titles, that's something that we'll continue to calibrate and think about. We include quite a few different kinds of titles right now, including materials that are kind of textbook oriented. And Sue will talk a little bit about the scope of her work as well and some of the collections that they've chosen. I think our scope will definitely broaden over time though. This is just a quick snapshot of our what our system looks like. It's fairly lightweight. This is something where you do need to be signed in through our single sign-on system to actually take advantage of it. Again, mainly we're making this link available to students or to instructors to use via the course reserves program. And it does allow you to just click that borrow. It knows when you check something out, it returns it on your behalf. So it's fairly seamless and something that's been really, really nice since we've been able to set up, again, the more automated version of the system. And then finally, just talking about future work very briefly. Continuing to grow the program across collections and programs. We are having some conversations about interlibrary loan and having, I think, some very initial conversations about what consortial models would look like. I know that's kind of something that's on a lot of our minds. How do we have some economies of scale around controlled digital lending, whether it's in terms of scanning, in terms of platform and technology, et cetera. Our special collections are a big point of conversation. For instance, we have a really rich Latin American and Caribbean collection, and I would really love to see more of that made available via controlled digital lending. A lot of that falls into that kind of unclear copyright status, especially because much of it is international. But I think those would be really good candidates for CDL. And then again, I mentioned our offsite storage and some of the collections there. We're continuing to talk to other institutions, watching as some of these other models grow, and really nice, in some ways, for me at least, to be able to take a back seat and see how others are developing in some areas that we really haven't even talked about yet. I mentioned periodically evaluating our scope and our constraints, continuing to talk to our peers and make sure that we're comfortable with what kind of our risk threshold is. And then finally, I'm participating in a NISO project, which is funded by the Mellon Foundation. And this has brought together a group of, I think about 30 or so people, kind of coming together to write up a report of recommended practice around controlled digital lending. And that's been really exciting and also a challenge because a lot of this work is happening under our feet. A lot of it is moving really quickly as all of these systems and models develop. So we will see how that goes. It's hopefully will be released next year. So I will go ahead and end it there and pass it on to you, Sue.
Thanks so much, Perry. Okay, so our journey with CDL began back in June 2020 when we had no one on campus. We did similar things that you have did. We met with our IT, our general counsel, to discuss ways to share materials with our users in a safe and legal way. And in July 2020, here's where we diverged. We purchased the Leganto add-on from Ex Libris, and we joined a host of academic and public libraries that were looking to share their resources without loaning physical copies. So at the start of fall 2020, that semester, we created a workflow for which our course reserve requests were checked against our catalog holdings for e-resources. And then if something was found, we linked to that item. However, if no e-resource could be found, we worked with faculty to see if a chapter or a section of the material could be digitized. And when we completed our cohort implementation, most libraries intended to pilot the system. However, we didn't do that. We went to production and we launched with about 30 courses for fall of 2020. We did not digitize textbooks, personal items, or more than about 10% of a monograph. And library staff created the courses and the reading lists for the faculty. In spring 2020, we duplicated that process and we had about 27 courses with reading materials, and the drop-in number there, and then this, you probably can relate to this, actually reflects our typical course reserve numbers because spring is typically later than fall. So in summer 2021, Ex Libris rolled out several features in Alma, Leganto, and Primo that supported controlled digital lending, including incorporating a wait list, early returns, and digital rights management features. And we took advantage of all of those. We worked with IT to configure our system to utilize all of these features, and we rolled them out in fall of 2021. And this actually began the true start to our offering controlled digital lending. It was our first venture into digitizing entire monographs and placing the physical copies behind our shelves to maintain that own to loan ratio. Utilizing the features of that Ex Libris implemented in August 2021, we were able to restrict these complete monographs to certain courses, create a wait list for the items, set time limits similar to our 2-hour course reserve time limits. We could allow for early return, renewal, and we could also prevent the items from being downloaded in their entirety. And then to educate and further promote the use of this service and digital course reserves, our team created a LibGuide with sections geared towards faculty and students separately. In fall 2021, we offered 35 fully digitized works, and we maintained 30 physical items for checkout. In spring 2022, just a little while ago, we actually saw an increase in CDL requests and had 42 fully digitized items. Now, this past spring, things changed again, and Ex Libris rolled out additional enhancements by adding read and respond and assignment and grading features that integrate with Leganto and a campus's learning management system. At Rice, we utilized the Canvas LMS and spent this summer testing and promoting these features by offering faculty virtual office hours a few days, several times a week. The new features allow faculty to create assignments within Canvas that draw upon resource materials faculty have requested for course reserves and library staff have already digitized. CDL items move from being static required readings that may never be read by students to items that are tied to an assignment and ultimately a grade for the course. And we haven't figured out how much that has gotten used, but we're hoping to promote that as we go throughout the year. So a little bit about the logistics of digitizing at Rice. We utilize a team of 5 full-time and 2 part-time circulation staff to digitize materials. The team utilizes a shared spreadsheet, which provides transparency on who's working on what digitization, how many digitizations each team member is working on. And we recently purchased a second scanner as the volume of scanning between ILL and course reserves had grown and we couldn't share anymore. We also attended training from Image Access, who provided our second book eye, and we learned about best practices for scanning. Now we scan at 150 DPI, and we were told to scan with a bitonal setting and to set the scan to full bed. A few other best practices they told us about was to scan pictures, graphs, and charts at 300 DPI, and to reduce file size. To save that, use the color scanning set to JPEG formats and the black and white scanning to TIFF formats. We also learned that using the foot pedal on the Book Eye scanner makes scanning faster. And then when we have issues with files not completely scanning, we have staff stitch those files together using Adobe Acrobat. So to streamline the CDL process, we do the following. When faculty make a course reserves request, we'll check with our subject librarians to see if the requested item can be obtained as an e-resource. And if this is possible, we wait for notification that the license has been activated and process the ebook version with a link that's then reflected on the instructor's reading list and through the learning management system. However, if no ebook version is available and faculty need more than just a few chapters scanned, we offer to digitize the material and then hold the item behind the circulation desk. A PDF file is uploaded to our Alma back end of the house system, and we test to ensure the loads are correct in the catalog and that they're viewable through the Leganto and Canvas. Then finally, once files have been uploaded and the reading list is published, students can immediately view the material, and we assign a 2-hour checkout, similar to the same that we would have for traditional physical reserves. There's a little timer icon that tells the students how much time they have remaining while viewing the material, and students can return an item early, or they can renew the item if no one has it checked out. They don't need to come back to the desk to do this. They can do it wherever they are, wherever they're studying. And if the item is in use, students are placed in a waitlist queue and notified via email when the item becomes available. So here we are in the back end of Alma, where staff work on courses, reading lists, and citations. And this is an example of a citation that has been added to a reading list. If I click on the link to the course under reading list, it will bring me to a full screen of information on the course and additional citations associated with this course. This is the result of clicking the reading list or editing a citation within a reading list. I'm brought to this specific citation within the reading list where I can upload a file, change the status of a reading list, and make additional changes. At the bottom, I see there are additional citations because this is page 1 of 3. Now, as I scroll down, I can see the other citations. Some of them are e-resources, and they appear with a green dot and the word electronic. Now, if I've added files, they'll show up as green dots under other. Those are the items that have been digitized. I can also still use the system to show that a course has physical items that students must come to use at the library, and those are listed as a green dot under physical. Within the backend system, I can test how a file looks by clicking the ellipsis button next to a citation and select View in Leganto. This will allow me to ensure that the file renders correctly in the catalog. And here I have selected View in Leganto for a particular source, and this is what it will look like for faculty and staff to review in Leganto. For this particular file, students are able to simply download the file as it's a work by the faculty member. On the left side of the screen is an example of a faculty member's digitized work that a student assigned to this course may download. On the right is a screenshot of a digitized work with a 2-hour access policy timer. So this is a digitized monograph, and there's an icon next to the item to return the work early or possibly renew the item. Note that there's no ability to download this digitized work on the monograph. We've added these digitized files into a course reserves collection as an optional way for students to find their course reserves material. On the left are the available collections, and on the right is the course reserves collection opened to show all digitized files. Now, only current active courses will allow patrons to access the digitized files, and inactive courses leading to digitized files will refer the patron back to the actual physical material at this time. So that's one thing that we are working with them to try and change, to be able to suppress and hide those that are not active. So our question has been, if we digitize our materials, will they use them? That's what we've been asking ourselves. And through this entire process, we have never let usage discourage our efforts with controlled digital lending. Just with just the same as with physical reserves, some items will have high checkouts and others will receive 0 checkouts. We just know that's just the way things go. On the left, you'll see that our physical and electronic collections are, are immense compared to our small but growing digital collections of 90 files of the digitized material. However, it's the graphic on the right that really highlights the strength of our digitization work. So in 2021, when we really started this, we had 433 views for our digitized efforts. But this year in 2022, we've seen a steady increase in CDL usage with more than 1,000 views. That is 170% increase, and we're just at the start of the fall semester. Many libraries, including ours that have invested a lot into CDL, are not looking to go backwards. We are looking for opportunities beyond digitizing our resources and go beyond our communities, as Perry mentioned. We're paying attention, same as they are, to the many discussions going on among OCLC, Ex Libris, NISO, the consortium such as PALC and Boston, trying to figure out how to make CDL for ILL work. We've tried that in the past and have not been as successful with some of the offerings out there, but we know that this is something coming our way. Organizations are trying to determine how to make lending and borrowing pods, recalls, renewals, and early returns work, while also being mindful of copyright laws. And we also need to figure out how to better market CDL to our patrons to reduce shipping materials, which are costly and not environmentally friendly. We know that our FedEx bills keep going up. How do we cut that back? Finally, we also need to determine collectively, who's going to digitize what. There's a lot of content out there, not a lot of staff time, unfortunately, especially with all of our patrons back in the buildings. And we're trying to decide, should we focus on the patron-driven model, waiting for materials to be requested to be digitized, or should we begin digitizing our rarest and most fragile items that may no longer be accessible in the future? We hear about libraries every day that lose materials due to natural and other weather events, fires. These things just happen, and the material is just gone from the collections. So, how do we address those issues? We look forward to continuing this discussion, and you can reach out to either of us for more information to find out about our policies, our procedures. Perry mentioned that they have their workflows documented. We also have our workflows documented, and also our policies as well. So we're more than welcome to share any of that with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Perry and Sue. That was an awesome presentation. We have several questions, so I want to get right into them for you since we only have a few minutes left. The first one, Perry, you mentioned the Kyle Courtney white papers. A lot of people are asking what was the name of those white papers.
Absolutely. Let me just, to make everyone's life easier, let me just find the link to that, and then we can have it. This is honestly, I mean, I know there's a lot of other work going on, and I know that Kyle Courtney has been doing some kind of workshops with all of you recently, which is really great. But this has become kind of a foundational text of CDL in many ways, that it's often a jumping off point. I'll put it into the Zoom chat, Tammy, if you want to share via Whova, that would be great. And as it does go a little bit into the copyright weeds, but I think offers some general kind of pointers too, and sort of ways of thinking about and talking about CDL that I have found really valuable.
Okay, perfect. I'll get that copied over. I'm on two different machines, so it makes it
Sorry
fun.
about that. Thank you.
No, you're so good. Let me get the next question up. What software do you use to lend your digital files while keeping them locked down?
So like I said, we have relied on a Google-based platform that is kind of the business version, as I understand it, of something like Google Drive. So it's made available to us through our university, and then we have been able to take advantage of complementary and open source tool that is kind of built on top of that to do the lending piece of this. But in terms of actually kind of locking down the files, not allowing downloads, things like that, Google allows that level of control and granularity with the files that we have.
I love seeing all of the comments in the chat and people are actually helping each other out with different solutions on downloading in different formats. So that's excellent to see.
Okay, it says, my biggest issue is how do we make sure the patron has access to the PDF for a limited time only?
So I don't know, do you want to try that one or?
Well, for us, it's built into the software. So we have it configured to only allow for a 2-hour time limit. That can be changed. If we wanted to set it for a 4-hour time limit or overnight, we could set those parameters. But we just have all of our faculty, as they've come back, have been amenable to doing the 2-hour time limit, and it just basically cuts them off, and the document actually disappears. So that's it for us. I think you folks also had some sort of a timer set with the Google Docs. Mm-hmm.
That's right, exactly. Yes, and early on that was a little trickier with Google. Like, would let you time it, but it wouldn't kick people off in the same way. Now it will with the tool that we have. So we are able to do that. And if anyone's interested in learning more about that tool, I can share that with you and put you in touch with my IT colleagues who worked on that.
And we do have a question about if either of you are willing to share your policies or strategies that you have created for CDL, which I believe you mentioned at the end. Is it best for them to just email you, or do you want to maybe attach it to the session if that's possible?
Yeah, I think maybe for now, if you all don't mind, I think email might be best. I'd like to touch base with my colleagues and just make sure before we put it in a recording like this, but I think there's nothing too sensitive and it is public. So I'm very happy if anyone wants to email me, and then once I touch base, I'm happy to share and maybe attach it to the session recording too.
Yeah, and I'd be also more than willing to share out our policy and procedures. Definitely.
You kind of touched on this one a little bit, but someone's asking what platforms or methods you're using to limit the digital access to 2 hours, and does it work the way that you want to, and are there things that you would change about it?
I did ask my colleagues before this if there was anything new or anything that they would change, and I think not. I think technically it's worked out really well for us. It doesn't connect to some of our other systems the way that Sue's mentioned. It doesn't integrate quite as neatly or cleanly, but it works very, very well for us, again, using tools that we already had at our disposal. So that's been great.
Yeah, for us, we've had no issues with it, other than, we're watching and adopting all of the different, minor implementations that Ex Libris makes with the product to take advantage of, every angle. We'd like to be able to sort of suppress for our inactive courses because it's still showing up. And the only way that I could figure is to actually delete the record, but then I'm actually deleting the physical record too. So I don't want to do that. And I hate to delete the actual record because it's the actual digitization that we have stored in the system that we might need to reactivate if a faculty decides to run that course again in the future, and they may or may not from semester to semester.
So someone's interested in CDL as it pertains to consortia lending. So are there specific copyright laws for items within an alliance or a consortium that you guys have had to deal with?
I think this is a great question. I've been part of the ILL subgroup for the NISO project I mentioned, and I think I saw 1 or 2 names from that group on this list of events as well. To be honest, I think we're still very much at a bit of a crossroads, not because those things aren't possible, but because we're trying to figure out logistically how it works and how to not only conceptually kind of put forth some of the controlled piece of this, those rights issues, but also just make sure that logistically we're able to follow through and keep those up and maintain them. As we know, it's kind of hard to come up with a practice and then keep it going if it's something that's new. That said, on the page where I put the controlled digital lending white paper, there is also now an ILL statement that was developed, and there are a number of signatories to that, including my institution. And so there's definitely a lot of interest. I know the Boston area consortium has been working, and maybe most heavily, that's the best example that I know of, working at a consortial level, and they have some additional funding recently. And I believe are working with the Reshare group on that. So I can't offer a lot of details there, but maybe others on this chat even could.
Well, that is unfortunately all the time that we have for questions and answers. I did post the post-session survey in the chat, so just want to send out a reminder that the presenters and NWILL use your comments and your feedback to help improve this conference even more for next year. Thank you for providing your email addresses, and I encourage anyone that still has questions that didn't get answered to reach out to you, and hopefully be able to get it set up for their own libraries or improve systems. I love this conference because we all learn from each other, and appreciate your time. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you. And thanks, Tammy.